Mike Stewart was used to getting what he wanted: tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with an arrogance that matched his wealth. He had carved out a world where things simply fell into place, or so he thought. At 35, he was at the top of his game in the business world. The CEO of Stewart Enterprises, a global corporation that controlled everything from tech startups to real estate, Mike was the embodiment of success. But all that had become predictable. That night, in the grand ballroom of his company's annual gala, Mike was surrounded by sycophants and status untouchable as his riches. But it was Robert, his old college buddy, who dared to challenge him, stirring a spark of something Mike hadn't felt in years: real intrigue. "Mike, you're always surrounded by models, socialites, the perfect women," Robert said, leaning in with a playful smirk. "How about we make things interesting?" Mike raised an eyebrow, the whiskey in his hand catching the dim light. "What do you mean by interesting?" Robert grinned. "I bet you can't marry a woman who isn't your type, a woman who doesn't fit your usual mold. No fancy dresses, no Instagram followers. Someone real, someone you can't buy." The room stilled for a moment, and Mike's laughter broke the silence. "You're serious? You think I can't land any woman I want?" Robert nodded, looking Mike in the eye. "I think you can't marry someone who isn't playing the game you've set. I'll give you 6 months. If you manage to do it, I'll hand you $1 million. But if you fail," Robert's grin turned sly, "then you'll owe me. And believe me, I always collect." Mike was silent for a beat, intrigued by the challenge. His world had become a series of predictable wins. But this was something different. The thought of not only winning but proving Robert wrong made the bet irresistible. 6 months, Mike said with a laugh, extending his hand. "Deal." The $1 million was nothing to him, but proving Robert wrong, making a woman who wasn't interested in his wealth fall for him, would be the real prize. Jenny Walsh was a woman who didn't fit in. She was 30, with a sharp, independent edge and a blunt honesty that made most people uncomfortable. A curvy, tall woman with wild, untamed red hair, Jenny had spent her life learning not to care about society's standards of beauty. She wore her self-assurance like a cloak, embracing her quirks and refusing to be anyone other than herself. As a small business owner in New York City, Jenny had made her way by her own merits, starting a successful flower shop that catered to those who sought the beauty in the simple things in life, things that were real, unpretentious, and down to earth. Her clients adored her, and she took pride in the relationships she built. Yet, the world she navigated was often harsh, especially when it came to men who saw her as an object, or worse, a challenge. When she was invited to Robert's party, a lavish, high society event where the men were slick, the women were flawless, and the air thick with privilege, she wasn't sure why she accepted. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was Robert's insistence that she should come see how the other half lives. Either way, she knew better than to expect much. As the evening wore on, Jenny noticed the familiar arrogance in Mike Stewart's gaze as he surveyed the crowd, his sharp eyes never lingering on anyone for long. And then Robert, with his mischievous grin, introduced her to Mike. Jenny wasn't easily impressed by men like Mike. His type was a dime a dozen in her world. But it was his overconfidence, the air of entitlement that surrounded him, that piqued her interest. "Mike, meet Jenny," Robert said with a gleam in his eye. Mike extended his hand, but Jenny only glanced at it before meeting his gaze. "I know all about your little bet, Mike," she said coolly. "I'm the woman you have to marry for 6 months." Mike's eyebrows shot up, clearly taken aback. "I beg your pardon." His voice carried an edge of disbelief, as if expecting everyone to fall in line with his usual charm. "You heard me," Jenny continued, unbothered by his surprise. "I'm not interested in your wealth, your status, or whatever you think will impress me. If we're doing this ridiculous bet of yours, don't expect me to play along with your games." Momentarily stunned, tried to regain control, flashing a charming smile that he had used 1,000 times before. "It's just a bet, Jenny. No harm, no foul." "Exactly," she replied, her tone firm. "No harm. But don't think for a second that I'll change who I am just to fit your fantasy. I'm here for 6 months, nothing more. So if you want me to pretend I'm your perfect match, you're wasting your time." Mike was silent for a long moment, his usual bravado fading. This woman wasn't impressed by his money, his looks, or his power, and that intrigued him. "Fair enough," Mike said, his voice low, "but don't expect me to go easy on you, either." Jenny met his gaze with a smile that barely touched her lips, I wouldn't have it any other way. The next few weeks passed in a blur of high society events and press coverage. Jenny's life, as she knew it, had shifted. Suddenly, she found herself attending extravagant dinners and galas, her presence beside Mike a constant spectacle for the paparazzi. But what had started as an arrangement fueled by Mike's arrogance quickly became something more, albeit a tension-filled game of wills. Mike's attempts to manipulate Jenny into fitting his ideal quickly ran into a wall. He was used to women who eagerly bent to his will, who saw his wealth and status as a gateway to a better life. But Jenny was different. She wasn't swayed by designer clothes or luxury cars. She didn't care about his position in the business world. All she cared about was maintaining her independence, and Mike found that increasingly difficult to control. He tried, of course. At first, it was small things, influencing her social calendar, forcing her to attend events he wanted her at, making her late for meetings. He even tried to sabotage her business, setting up a few aggressive competitors and encouraging them to undermine her flower shop. But Jenny had a resilience he had underestimated. One afternoon, when Mike arrived at her shop under the guise of checking in on her progress, he was surprised by the strength in her response. "I know what you're doing, Mike," Jenny said, meeting him at the door with her arms crossed. Her red hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and her expression was unreadable. "You think because you've made me part of your bet that you can control me. You can't. If anything, you're making me more determined not to play along." Mike hesitated. Her defiance unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had expected her to crumble, to bow down to his influence. Instead, she was digging in her heels. "I'm not here to be your puppet," she continued, her voice steady but firm. "I will be your wife for 6 months, as agreed, but I'll be damned if I let you turn me into something I'm not. You don't own me, Mike." For the first time, Mike was forced to confront something he hadn't considered. Jenny wasn't the typical woman who would fall for his charm or his wealth. She was a woman of substance, of grit. He found it frustrating, but there was also a part of him that admired her for it. The days following that conversation were tense. Mike was caught between his pride and the undeniable respect he was starting to feel for Jenny. She had a quiet strength, a determination that he couldn't break, no matter how hard he tried. And though it irked him to admit it, there were moments when he found himself drawn to her in a way that went beyond the superficial bet. It all came to a head one afternoon when Mike received a phone call that would change everything. He was sitting in his office reviewing some quarterly reports when his assistant buzzed in with urgent news. "Mr. Stewart, it's Jenny Walsh. She's here to see you, and she's demanding to speak with you immediately." Mike frowned, irritated. Jenny had no business at his office. This was a game, a bet, and he didn't want her interfering with his work. But there was something in her voice, something in the way she had spoken through the assistant, that stopped him from dismissing her outright. "Send her in," he said, already bracing for another confrontation. Jenny walked into his office with an uncharacteristic calm. There was no defiance in her stance, no fiery challenge in her eyes. Instead, she seemed distant, almost resigned. "Mike," she began, sitting across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I need to talk to you about something serious." Mike raised an eyebrow, his annoyance tempered by curiosity. "What's going on, Jenny? You know this is a business setting, right? We don't have time for games today." She didn't flinch at his tone. "This isn't a game. You've probably never heard of this, but I found something that connects you to my father." Mike's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" His voice remained steady, but there was a tension in the air now that hadn't been there before. Jenny looked at him with an intensity that cut through the tension. "You remember the Walsh Group? My father, Edward Walsh. He was a successful businessman in his own right, but his company fell apart due to a series of bad investments. I did some digging, Mike. Your company was one of the key players that caused his financial ruin. Your ruthless business tactics led to his downfall and eventually his death. You drove him to suicide." Mike's chest tightened, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. His father had always warned him about the consequences of ruthless ambition, but hearing Jenny's words hit him like a slap in the face. The pieces clicked into place. Edward Walsh had been a man Mike had heard about, but never connected to his own rise to power. "That's..." Mike's voice faltered, and he had to swallow before continuing. "That's a lie." Jenny leaned forward, her eyes blazing with cold fury. "It's the truth, Mike, and you can't hide behind your money or your charm anymore. I won't let you." Mike was speechless, the weight of her accusation suffocating him. This wasn't just a business setback or a failed marriage. This was real. He had ruined a family, a man's life, and all for what? More money, more power. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his mind spinning. I didn't know he was connected to that deal, Mike said, his voice low. I didn't. You didn't care, Jenny interrupted, her voice cold. That's the problem, Mike. You never cared. But now you will. Mike stopped in his tracks, looking at her. What do you want from me, Jenny? Her eyes softened just for a moment. I want you to feel it. I want you to understand the consequences of your actions. I want you to see the damage you've done not just to my father, but to people like me, to people who have to clean up your mess. Mike swallowed hard. This was a turning point, a breaking moment. He realized then that Jenny wasn't just here for revenge, she wanted him to change. And whether he liked it or not, he had to confront what he'd become. I don't know how to make this right, he admitted, his voice rough. Jenny nodded, her face hardening again. Then maybe you should start by fixing what's broken, Mike. Maybe you should start by fixing yourself. The words stung, but they also ignited something in him, something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt, shame, and for the first time in his life, the desire to make amends. In the weeks that followed, Mike Stewart was a man transformed. It wasn't instantaneous, change rarely was. But the first signs came slowly, in the form of small, deliberate gestures. He reached out to his former clients who had been affected by his ruthless dealings, offering apologies and financial settlements. He met with representatives from charities his company had ignored in the past and promised to donate to causes that help struggling families, particularly those in the industry he had once profited from. Jenny was watching him, of course. At first she was skeptical, unwilling to believe that his changes were anything more than a temporary act of contrition, but as Mike continued to follow through, his gestures became more sincere. He would show up at her flower shop, not as a husband trying to control her, but as a man attempting to rebuild the trust he had broken. It wasn't easy. Jenny's heart was still guarded, the pain of her father's death too raw to ignore. But little by little, as Mike's actions became more genuine, she found herself softening. She couldn't deny that he was really trying for the first time in his life. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of sorting through her father's old business records, Jenny found herself alone in the shop when Mike appeared at the door, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. I didn't know what kind to get, he said, looking slightly unsure, his usual confidence replaced with something more vulnerable. I thought maybe something simple would be better. Jenny took the flowers from him, her fingers brushing his hand. Simple is perfect, she said softly, her heart giving a reluctant flutter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in the quiet of the evening, Mike finally said the words he had been holding back for so long. I'm sorry, Jenny. For everything. And I know that sorry doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I'm not the same person I was when we started this bet. Jenny looked at him, the weight of his sincerity sinking in. I know, she whispered, and I think I'm starting to believe you. As they stood there, surrounded by the delicate scent of the flowers, something shifted between them, something real, something that hadn't existed before. The remaining months of their 6-month agreement passed in a blur of growth and change. Jenny began to see Mike in a new light, not as the arrogant businessman who had once treated people as pawns, but as someone who was trying to right his wrongs. The walls she had built around her heart began to crumble, piece by piece, until she found herself opening up to him in ways she never imagined. By the end of their time together, Mike and Jenny weren't just fulfilling the terms of a bet. They were building something real. And when the 6 months came to a close, they both knew that what they had was no longer temporary. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Jenny stood in the shop, holding a small bouquet of daisies, the same flowers Mike had brought her on that first day. She smiled as she arranged them in a vase, her heart swelling with a sense of peace. Mike walked in, a gentle smile on his face. I guess I've learned a thing or two about flowers, he said, his voice low and warm. Jenny laughed softly, her eyes meeting his. I think you've learned a lot more than that. He stepped closer, his hands reaching for hers. Jenny, I know we didn't start this the right way, but I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I can be the man you deserve. Will you marry me again, but this time for real? Her heart fluttered as she looked into his eyes, And for the first time, she saw the man he had become, not the businessman, not the arrogant player, but a man who had truly changed. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Mike, I will." And as they embraced, Jenny knew that their love, once born of a bet, had now become a promise. A promise to build a future together, not as two people bound by an agreement, but as equals, bound by the love they had found along the way. The renewed wedding celebration was an intimate affair, a gathering of close friends and family who had witnessed the transformation of Mike and Jenny's relationship. In the soft glow of candlelight, they exchanged vows once more, this time, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine love that had blossomed in the most unexpected of circumstances. As they stood together, hand in hand, looking out over the guests, Mike turned to Jenny and smiled. "Who would have thought it would come to this?" he whispered. Jenny laughed, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it?" And as they embraced once more, their love was no longer a bet, it was a new beginning. So if you love the story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.